Hello, everybody, and welcome again. Today, we'll be speaking to another author from the forthcoming book, Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission. And today, we'll be hearing from one of the co-editors of the book, Anthony Reddie, who's going to talk to us about his chapter. Welcome, Anthony. So please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Anthony Reddie. As you say, I'm one of the co-editors of the book. I work at Oxford University. I work at Regent's Park College. I'm the director of the Centre for Religion and Culture, based in Regent's Park College. I'm also a very, very part-time research fellow and a professor of theological ethics with the University of South Africa.
Thank you, Anthony. So could you briefly describe what your chapter's about?
Yeah, so my chapter, I'm looking at two phenomena that are linked. So one is around whiteness and deconstructing and decentering whiteness and the way in which it has such a powerful hold on the discipline of theology. So most theology, if it doesn't state something about its identity, that one just assumes it's white and assumes that it's been done by white people of European descent. And then the other aspect of it, really, which is linked, is then about decolonizing the curriculum. So how then do we think about enabling that in teaching and learning, particularly in theological education, the work that is linked to people who are ministers or trained to be ministers, that's overseen by the church, largely through common awards, that is done out of the University of Durham, how that then becomes less focus on whiteness and issues of white hegemony and entitlement and normality. So it's really those two issues that I'm sort of trying to untangle in my essay.
Okay. And can you let us know what made you take that particular approach to writing your chapter?
Yeah, well, in some respects, it was quite personal. So I think in the essay I talk about a moment when I was doing my A-levels, and an English teacher. I mean, in fairness, a very progressive English teacher in lots of ways. Gave me a copy of Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart, to read. And I remember him saying this was an important book for me to read. And I was the only black male in the class. I think there was one other black woman in the class. There was only two of us in the class of about 30 doing A-level English. And I remember him saying it was an important book to me, for me to read. And at the time, I remember thinking, why was it an important book for me to read, but not for everyone else in the class, particularly all the white people? And yet, at that moment, we were going through Jane Austen's book called Emma, which was set for one of our A-level texts. And as I could, and at the time, I remember thinking, well, what makes Emma universal? All of us have to read her, irrespective of whether I have any identification with her or not. It was compulsory to read it as part of the A-level text. But yet Chinua Achebe was writing about his particular world and right from his particular perspective. His relevance is only for me as one of only two black people in the class. So what then makes him relevant only to me because he's writing about his context, but Jane Austen's probably doing exactly the same, writing about her little context. Somehow she then becomes generic and universal. So that really was the starting point, because when you then extend it, we see how that then works in academic theology. So you have white authors like Karl Barth and Calvin and Schleiermacher and more recently, Hillig, people like that, who are read by everyone, and they're read all over the world, and they are part of the curriculum that is seen as an essential building block to do academic theology. And yet, for the most part, someone like James Cone, who is kind of my hero, all-time hero, is now still only read in certain places by some people, but it's rarely seen as being someone that you have to read in a generic fashion. That somehow, if you don't read James Cone, then you're not doing proper theology. Well, no one really says that, even though I think that should be the case, but actually that is certainly the case with many white authors. So yeah, so I think that was the starting off point really for writing the article. So I think the anecdotes in the essay, and then I really go from that to look in more depth at the way in which theology is produced, particularly in terms of the common awards elements, and then to think about what are the implications then of that in terms of how knowledge is produced and who gets affirmed and who does not.
Okay, thank you. So what would you say has shaped your social conscience, especially in in pertaining to issues of race or inclusivity, diversity, etc.?
That's a very good question. I'll probably say maybe three overlapping elements. So one would be my parents, particularly my mother. She was a very, very strong Christian, but just had a very instinctive sense of natural justice and the need to treat all people equally and to give people respect and not to believe in terms of certain hierarchies. I mean, so although she wasn't a particularly political person, so she wouldn't have been a person who would have sat you down and give you lots of lessons on this, just all the things you picked up from how she lived and how she engaged with people. Just like I think that put into my mind very clearly the needs that essentially people are equal and we should not be conforming to notions of hierarchy that assume that some people are better than other people. So, so although the Bradford I grew up in at the time in the 70s and 80s was very racist, very, very class-based, and the church we went to was equally so. There was something very strong about the way in which she lived her life and their Christian values that I think clearly rubbed off on me. So that's the first link. The second one then actually would be the church. So although not necessarily the whole church, but there were some key Sunday school teachers and class leaders who were very, very supportive. And I think they lived out what I would say is the best of the Methodist tradition. So Methodist tradition, like all traditions, is complex and varied and comes in different guises. And the truth is not everyone necessarily lived it out in the church. But I think intrinsically in normative Methodist teaching is this thing about all people being equal. And if there are hierarchies, then the hierarchies are not steep ones. They're a relatively small gradient between, let's say, the people who probably have control of the church and then the ordinary members. And so these particular, I think one of the key ones was my favorite Sunday school teacher, a guy called Mr. Salter, who long dead now, I'm sure, who was a Jewish emigre from Austria, I believe, and he was a physicist in his day job at Sheffield University. But he was my favorite Sunday school teacher, and I remember him telling my mother that I was bright and I should be encouraged to do well at school. And it's not that I didn't know I was bright already. I think my parents were always very supportive, particularly my mother was, and I think I knew I wasn't stupid. But I think having a white authority figure give you that kind of affirmation in what was a very racist time where most black people were not told anything of the sorts. And certainly when I was growing up, I do not know any black middle class people in Bradford. Everyone worked in factories or were cleaners. I don't know anyone who had any kind of work that had any kind of responsibility, or people who you would describe as being professionals. And so I think the church had a big impact. And then finally, the school. So I went to a large comprehensive school that in previous times had been a grammar school, but Bradford was one of those places that abolished grammar schools and abolished the 11 plus. So I never taught 11 plus. There are no grammar schools to go to. The ones that opted out of the system then became private schools. And I had some fabulous teachers. So the same English teacher, never mentioned because he's still alive. But he otherwise was, I mean, apart from maybe like the little faux pas with the book, the Chinua Achebe book. But I know what he was trying to do. He was trying to affirm it in reading Black literature. So I don't take the example of saying it was a book for me to read too negatively. But certainly he was a very good teacher. And then I had a really, really brilliant history teacher as well. And they were both very supportive of me. But also, I think they were both outsiders. So the English teacher was Irish, and he would often rail against English and talk about some of the racism he faced. My history teacher, what might be said is now since come out, but he was gay at the time. Not that he would have been particularly demonstrative about talking about it, but certainly the older I got, I think that's when we got to sixth form, it was kind of clear that he was, and he would sometimes share his experience of discrimination as a gay man. And so I think both of them being outsiders, they had a sense of what it felt like not to be part of the mainstream and to be seen as a problem. And so I think they immediately identified with me, and they were very encouraging of me to use my abilities as the best I could. But then also they were quite determined in order to say to me, you don't have to conform to stereotypes, so you can be wherever you want to be. And certainly you have the potential to transcend any limitation or transcend any particular box that people want to put you into. And I think that had a huge impact on me. So I think so that's my level. Bradford to go to Birmingham University. There was a degree of confidence, not that I would have been hugely confident at the time, but I think there was a kind of inner steel there that said that I was going to try and be different from the context and the culture that had shaped me in terms of inner city Bradford and all the limitations that kind of came with being in that particular place. So yes, I would say that those were the three overarching things that have kind of sort of shaped my perspective. I mean, I didn't discover Black theology until much later, but I think there were already some roots there that helped to give rise to some of the later work in terms of getting into Black liberation theology and then becoming a writer and a teacher and an activist and a researcher. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. So another big question. What do you think are the biggest challenges that face the church and wider society in terms of creating better frameworks for social justice?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's quite a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think my instinctive reaction in the first instance is probably to go back to some things I say in the chapter. So I think one of the things we have not done as a nation is to wrestle with our history and to wrestle with the way in which whiteness has become such a part of how Britishness, particularly Englishness, is framed, that until we kind of have a better sense of what that is, how we understand that, then I don't think we will make as much progress as we should do as a nation in terms of issues around justice and equity. So let me give an example. A few weeks ago, I got an email from an alumni of the college where I work. And this person was saying, they've all been in touch with me before, off and on, over number times. I think ever since I was appointed, I think they've had, this person's had a kind of curiosity about the fact that I hold this post in a college where they had studied about 40 odd years ago. In a college that is still very white, and for which I'm pretty correct in saying that I'm the first non-white person who's worked in that college who's not a domestic, not a cleaner, not a cook, but someone who's part of the academic staff. And so he was asking me about a particular book that just come out by an Oxford academic that is pro-colonialism and pro-empire, and asked me what I thought. So I gave my thoughts, not in any huge detail, just said, well, I didn't think it was a great book, and I was particularly taken with it, and I think it's problematic. The guy then comes back with a long list of reasons to why I'm wrong, and why the book is actually quite reasonable and why he likes it, and tells me that actually that what I need to understand is that history is complex. I accept that, and there's good and bad on both sides, and we can't let our own personal feelings get in the way of objective facts that come through the life of Jesus Christ. Objective facts. Now, here's the point I made in the email. In my initial reply, I said to him, I said that the problem I have with how history has been framed, particularly around colonialism, so this is some of the things that we're talking about in our book, is that most white people cannot concede that Africans deserve the same agency, the same sense of self-determination to do with your life and your land how you choose, even if you're doing it wrongly. That's still your right. But of course, their justification for colonialism is that somehow they improved the places that they invaded. And I'm sure they did in many respects. I'm sure that they did that. They brought the railways. I mean, although that's a bit ridiculous argument, but I hear people sort of say, oh, by the way, you know, like we did all this exploitation, but like we brought railways. Well, whoopee-doo, you know. But anyway, okay, railways and schools and education, and they outlawed certain indigenous practices that were cruel and barbaric, and they brought civilization. I'm not even going to question that. If that's what they say, that's what they did, fine. But here's the rub. What gave people the right to go into people's land in the first place and to control their resources, control their agency, limit their agency on the basis that you had a right to improve their lives? The reverse would never happen. So I remember saying to the same guy, I said, well, you know, I said, imagine, so therefore going by your logic, if a superior race came from another planet, but came with better technology, came with a much more advanced sense of civilization that could correct all the bad and barbaric things that we do in our culture, let's say, for example, could eradicate poverty tomorrow so there was no one sleeping on the streets because they would force us to live and share our resources in a way that we clearly do not do now. If that race of people could come, would anyone then say, well, that's a first one. Yes, okay, like you've come, you've improved us, and therefore you can come and take over our land, take over our institutions, change our cultures, our traditions, and make us do things that are better because you have decided. Would anyone ever concede that as a point? Of course, like they never would. They would never concede that as a point. And yet, when I put that to him, as a reason why fundamentally I simply cannot accept this book and I cannot accept any notion of manifest destiny around colonialism, which is, like I said, an impact, which is not to say that there are not some good things. I'm not even getting into some good things. I'm just asking a basic question about self-determination and agency and dignity that gives you the right to control your own household, your own existence. And he just dismissed it out of him, simply dismissed it, because in his mind, there was not a conversation to be had because they were still working on the basis of white supremacy and superiority. And that's our problem, is that because our history is still shaped with those particular markers in place, that still assumes that somehow that what is good for the goose is not good for the gander, like to go back to a saying from when I was a kid. So because those things are still in place, I think it's really difficult for even relatively moderate white people to have a sense of what justice and equity looks like, both in terms of understanding our history and acknowledging and critiquing it, in addition to then asking the question about what then happens in our contemporary society. Just give another very quick example about this asymmetrical relationship around whiteness. Shamina Begum, the young woman of Bangladeshi Muslim background descent who went abroad and obviously was radicalized, and she's not been allowed to come back into the UK. I think what has been missed in the midst of the government action against her is a fundamental change in how we think about British society and our laws and our precedents. Because what it says is that both you and I have parents who are not born, parents who are not born in this country. So what that says is, it says that our citizenship is a conditional one in a way that is not the same for white people. So basically, so because she was radicalized in London, by the way, but went abroad, she now cannot come back. What the government have said is, well, actually, that she can go to Bangladesh. That's where her parents from. She never set foot in Bangladesh, by the way. She's British. I think she should come back. Yes, if they say she should come back and she should face justice, I have no argument with that. If her actions were deemed to be illegal, then let her face justice in the country where she was born. But to refuse her to come back, to make her stateless, so she has no state at the moment, which is illegal, by the way. That effectively says what we've always really believed is that, like, there's two levels of citizenship. There's the first class for white people, so the ones whose parents and grandparents and great grandparents are here. So presumably, if a white working class young woman had been radicalized and gone abroad, so where would they send her? They would send her like back to Norway because, I don't know, several hundred years ago, her great ancestors actually were Vikings, maybe. You know, I mean, they wouldn't. She would have an automatic right to come back because she would be intrinsically British. What effectively this action by the government has said is that there are first and second class citizens, and the first class ones are white, which we've always known. We've always known any person who is vaguely on the left and has been interested in anti-racist work has always known there's been this is a two-tier system. But what that effectively says is that some of us whose parents or immediate forebears come from other places, our citizenship can be revoked and we can be effectively kicked out or told that we can't come back if we leave. That is a fundamental change in terms of how we think about society, where we are told on the one hand that all of us are equal, we're all important, we all are subject to the same laws, and yet what we also know is, which has always been existing, it's just that now that post Brexit we have a right wing government, probably even more right wing than Thatcher ever was back in the 80s, is now bringing in policies that even she wouldn't have dared to bring in. which effectively is saying that essentially there's this two-tier system, and white people at the top and black and brown people are in subordinate positions. And the worst thing about it is that the people who are enacting it, people who are overseeing it, are black and brown people whose parents were migrants, just like us.
Thank you for that. I think there's a lot there to unpack. Thank you. So finally, what do you hope people will take away from your chapter?
It's my hope that people will be challenged. I've tried to write it, as I do all my work, to be reasonably accessible. I try not to have too many big words up. Probably too many big words in it already, if I'm honest. But it's to challenge people to think about the things that we often don't see or the things that we're not always aware of. There's this great quote that I've used lots and lots of times in lots of different talks over the last 2 or 3 years post murder of George Floyd, that comes from James Baldwin, who says that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so in the chapter, I'm hoping that there are things that we will face, particularly this thing about whiteness, the way in which it's often tacit, it's invisible, and yet it's this entity that shapes and shrouds almost everything. Certainly in terms of academic theology, it still does. Just the other day, I was pointed to a tweet where there's a conference taking place in the European Academy at a major university in Britain, and all the keynote speakers are white. All of them are white. There's not one person who's not white, and this is an academic conference on theology in 2023. And basically, it's operating as if black people don't exist. So part of it is to recognize that there's a particular problem with Christianity and a particular problem with how Christian theology is developed. There's a particular problem with the relationship between colonialism and empire. That in the book I talk about David Livingstone's 3 C's. That is definition that what underpinned the British Empire was commerce, civilization, and Christianity. And so it's to ask the question, what are we not seeing? Why are we not seeing it? How can we be more self-aware of some of the limitations of how both Christian mission and empire, how Christian mission and empire often go hand in hand, and how Christianity helped to shape the development of empire, and how that has distorted the relationships between the powerful and the powerless in comparative terms over the last 400, 500 years. And we are still reproducing those forms of relationships, both within our individual churches. So one of the things we still don't talk about is white flight. You know, I mean, so every church now that's a black majority church within the historic tradition of those congregations that go back 300, 400 years in terms of the ones that were formed, obviously, let's say pre-Enlightenment, you know, Anglican, Methodist, Baptist, URC, Catholics, or the major churches. Every one of those churches now that's a black majority church was once upon a time a white majority church. And white people moved out as black people moved in. So what you have is white flight, both in the broader culture. So certain areas now that are predominantly, let's say, Islamic, predominantly Muslim, or predominantly Hindu, or maybe going back 15, 20, 30 years, predominantly African Caribbean, used to be all white areas. So you have white flight in the broader secular culture. But even more scandalously, you might say, is that same white flight exists within the church, where we talk about the body of Christ and all of us being one, all of us being shaped by one baptism and one Lord, and this unity that we talk about a Christian identity that transcends these other so-called woke identities. And yet, having said all of that, we still have white people lead churches when too many people like us turn up in there. And not only does it happen, but no one wants to talk about it except for people like me. So we don't write about it. White people never write about it. They'll write about everything else, but they won't talk about their own complicity in terms of their whiteness that is linked to issues of power and a form of self-determination that they assume for themselves, but can't acknowledge is a part and parcel of their black and brown brothers and sisters in the faith. So I think those are some of the big issues that we have to try and face. And my hope is that my chapter will just do a little bit in maybe opening up some awareness around that, open up some level of self-consciousness in terms of people's own limitations and maybe sometimes their fragility in not wanting to face it. As Baldwin says, if you don't face something, then you can never change it. And then hopefully, maybe, just maybe, I'm not expecting too much, but maybe it might lead to some activism. It might lead to the ways in which we do church differently in a way that begins to refute the worst of our past and draws on what, in theory, we say that we believe when we look at the gospel, particularly when we look at the New Testament, and we think about the actions of Jesus and the example that he sets us. That's the hope anyway. We will see.
Thank you for that, Anthony. So thank you for giving us a bit of insight into your work and also your chapter, and we look forward to reading it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.